He had $18, a lame horse, and a dead brother's rifle. The only thing he had left of the boy who died in his arms at Antietam. He rode 14 miles to buy a workhorse, but when he got there, he saw a girl chained to a fence post next to the mules, flies on her bare feet, cigarette burns on her arms, and 2 fingers that had healed crooked from being snapped backward. The horse cost $20. The girl cost $20. He could only choose one. What he did next cost him everything, and saved them both. This story teaches us the price of doing the right thing is never cheap, but the cost of standing still while someone suffers is something you carry forever. And freedom is not something that's given. It's something you build, one fence post at a time, with your own 2 hands. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk, where the fading light of the Old West reveals stories of sacrifice, redemption, and the fierce, quiet love between souls who refuse to be broken. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community. If this story gripped you from the very first word, like this video and tell me in the comments, what would you have done at that auction yard? Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you.
The draft horse had gone down 6 days ago. Colic. Elias found her on her side in the barn stall with her belly swollen tight as a drum and her legs stiff and her eyes already going to glass. He stood there for a while looking at her because that horse represented the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving it. And a man needs a moment to understand when the arithmetic of his life has changed. He dug the grave himself. July ground in Wyoming territory was not generous to shovels. The earth cracked and split in pale slabs, and the dust rose in clouds that stuck to the sweat on his face and turned him the color of the land he was trying to open. Flies gathered before he was 2 feet deep. They always knew before you did. 42 years old. 14 years alone on this ranch in Black Hollow Valley, where the land was cheap because nobody in their right mind wanted it. 200 acres of sagebrush and thin grass and a creek that ran strong in April and weak by July, and sometimes not at all by September. A cabin with a warped porch. A barn with a roof that sagged in the middle like a tired horse. A corral fence broken in 6 places that he kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing, because one man cannot do everything, and choosing what to let fall apart is its own kind of labor. He had 3 chickens. He had a lame saddle mare named Juniper who favored her left foreleg and could not pull a plow or drag timber, but could carry a man if the man was patient and the road was flat. He had $18 in coin in a tin under his bed. And he had a Winchester model 1873 on his back with the initials TB carved into the stock in 2 crooked letters that caught the light when the sun hit them right. Thomas had carved those letters the morning before Antietam, September 16th, 1862. He was 17 years old and he used a pocket knife, and he laughed while he did it. Said he wanted the rifle to remember him in case the Confederates did not. Thomas was always saying things like that, making jokes out of the dark because the dark was coming whether you joked about it or not. The Confederates remembered him just fine. Elias finished the grave. He dragged the horse into it with a rope and Juniper's reluctant help. He shoveled the dirt back. He did not mark the spot. It was a horse, not a person, and the ground did not care about the difference even if he did. He washed his hands in the creek and stood in the yard and looked at what he had. No draft horse meant no cutting hay. No hay meant the 3 cattle he still owned would starve before February. No cattle meant no ranch. The math was simple, and the math was fatal. And the only variable left was a man named Marlowe Griggs who ran a trading post 14 miles south and sold horses that men like Elias could almost afford. He saddled Juniper. She stood patient while he cinched the girth and adjusted the stirrups and checked her left foreleg, the way he checked it every time, running his hand down the cannon bone and feeling for heat. No heat today. She was sound enough for a walk, not much more. He rode south. The road was rutted dirt between sagebrush flats that stretched to the horizon in every direction, like God had started making something and lost interest halfway through. Grasshoppers cracked out of the weeds at every step. The sun was straight overhead and mean about it. The kind of July heat that does not burn you so much as lean on you, pressing down with the patient weight of something that has nowhere else to be. 14 miles is a long ride on a lame horse. Elias spent it the way he spent most of his hours, in silence, with his hand finding the Winchester on his back every few minutes, the way a man touches a wound to see if it still hurts. It always did. Griggs' trading post sat at the junction of the South Road and the East Road, a low wooden building with a covered porch and a hitching rail, and a hand-painted sign that said, Griggs General Trade, in letters that had faded from black to gray. Behind the main building was an auction yard fenced with rough-cut pine where Griggs kept livestock he was selling, and livestock he was holding for men who owed him money, which in this part of Wyoming was most men. Elias tied Juniper to the rail and stepped inside. The store smelled like tobacco and leather, and the particular sourness of a building that never quite got enough air. Griggs was behind the counter weighing tobacco on a brass scale. He was a short man with a wide face and small eyes that moved faster than the rest of him, always counting, always calculating, always looking at a thing and seeing not what it was, but what it was worth. He did not look up. Boone. You look worse than last time. I need a horse. Everybody needs something. Griggs set down the tobacco. Got 2 out back. Bay gelding, strong, no problems. $35. And a gelding with a bad hock. I will let him go for 20. I got 18 cash and a Winchester. Griggs looked up then. His eyes went to the rifle on Elias's back, and something changed in them. A light. The particular light of a man who has just seen something he wants. That the 73? Yeah, the one with the carving on the stock. Elias did not answer. He set the Winchester on the counter. The wood was warm from his back. The carved initials caught the light from the window. 2 crooked letters, TB. Griggs ran his thumb over them the way a man runs his thumb over a coin to test the metal. I will take 18 in the rifle for the gelding with the bad hock. Done. But then Griggs leaned across the counter and his small eyes got a different kind of light in them. Not greed this time. Something more like a man who has a card he has been waiting to play. Come out back, Boone. 2 minutes. Got something you ought to see. I am not here for anything else. Just come look. 2 minutes, that is all. Elias followed him through the back door into the auction yard. 3 mules stood in the far corner by a water trough with green scum on the surface. A rooster scratched at the dirt. The heat was worse out here where the fence held the air still and the ground baked white. And chained to the fence post between the mules, sitting with her knees pulled tight to her chest and her head down and her hair hanging in her face like a curtain she had drawn against the world, was a girl. Elias stopped walking. Griggs smiled the way a man smiles when he is about to sell you something you did not come to buy. Clara had counted the flies on her feet. 14 on the left, 11 on the right. Counting kept her breathing steady, and steady breathing kept her invisible, and invisible was the only safe thing to be. She had been in this yard for 3 days. She knew the exact number because she counted everything. 7 steps from the fence post to the water trough. 12 from the trough to the gate. Griggs' men checked on her twice a day. Morning and dusk. Never at night. The mules were watered at dawn and ignored the rest of the time. The rooster lived under the porch of the main building and came out when the shadows got long. The shackle on her right wrist had worn through the first layer of skin on the second day. The raw place wept clear fluid that attracted the flies. She did not swat them. Moving attracted attention, and attention attracted hands, and hands were never good. She was 20 years old. She had been property for 4 of those years, though the word nobody used was the word that fit. Her stepdaddy, Amos Dunn, had been a decent man, a small rancher who could not read or write and signed everything with an X, and treated Clara's mother with a gentleness that surprised everyone who knew him, because he was built like a man who should have been rough, but was not. He died when Clara was 16. A hoarse kick to the chest that stopped his heart before he hit the ground, and the world that had been tolerable became something else entirely. Amos's younger brother, Cyrus Whitlock, showed up 3 days after the funeral. He had a piece of paper he called a will. He said Amos had left Clara in his care. He said it was legal. He said a lot of things in a voice that was calm and patient and never raised above a conversational tone, which Clara would learn was the most dangerous volume a man could speak at, because it meant he did not need to shout. Men who shout are afraid of something. Men who speak quietly have already decided what they are going to do, and do not care if you hear them coming. Clara had tried to escape twice. The first time, Cyrus broke 2 of her fingers, bent them backward over the edge of the kitchen table and pushed until they snapped, one and then the other, while she screamed into the rag he had stuffed in her mouth. He called it a lesson. The second time, he burned her. 7 times. A lit cigar pressed to the inside of her forearm, wrist to elbow, evenly spaced with the calm precision of a man performing a task he had done before and expected to do again. He called it a reminder. The third time, she did not run. She walked to Harlan Bridge and stood on the rail and looked down at the water moving fast and cold below her, and she thought about letting go. She stood there a long time. She did not jump. 3 days ago, Cyrus had brought her to Griggs. He owed Griggs $60 for laudanum, the opium tincture he used for his back pain, and he could not pay. He offered Clara instead. Griggs took her. That was the transaction. $60 of debt erased for a 20-year-old girl who could cook and clean and mend clothes and haul water and chop wood and do everything else Cyrus had made her do for 4 years. Griggs chained her in the auction yard next to the mules because that was where he kept things he was selling. 2 days ago, a man had come. Older, maybe 60, sharp blue eyes. He had a leather bag on his saddle, the kind a doctor carries. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at Clara for a long time. She could feel his eyes on her, even with her head down. He asked Griggs the price. Griggs said $20. The man with the doctor's bag opened his mouth, closed it, turned around, rode away without buying anything at all. Clara filed him in the place where she kept information about men. The man who asked the price and left. She did not blame him. Blame required expecting something from people, and Clara had stopped expecting things from people at 17, which was the year she learned that expectation was just a different word for a target you paint on your own chest. Now another man was standing at the edge of the yard. Griggs had brought him out through the back door of the trading post. Clara did not lift her head. She read him the way she read everyone, not through his words, but through his body. You could lie with words. The body told the truth whether it meant to or not. He walked with a slight hitch on the right side. Lower back pain, chronic, the kind that comes from years of labor and never quite goes away. His left hand drifted to the rifle on his back without conscious thought, 2 fingers finding the stock and resting there the way a man touches something he relies on. Soldier's habit. Years deep, maybe decades. He looked at Griggs with distrust but not fear, which meant he did not owe Griggs anything, and that was unusual in this part of the territory where Griggs had hooks in almost everyone. Then he looked at her. Clara had been looked at by a lot of men in 4 years. She knew the categories. There was the look that calculated what she could do. There was the look that calculated what could be done to her. There was the look that saw nothing at all, the way a man sees a fence post or a hay bale, objects in the landscape that do not require acknowledgement. This man's look did not fit any category she had. It was heavy and flat, and it carried something she could not immediately name. Not appetite, not calculation, not indifference. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man who sees a wrong thing and knows it is wrong and cannot make himself look away. Griggs was talking. Clara listened. Same price, Griggs was saying. $20 for the gelding or $20 for the girl. Your choice, Boone. The rancher did not answer right away. Clara counted his breathing. Steady, then not steady, then steady again. A man fighting something inside himself. Clara raised her head just enough to speak. She did not beg, she did not plead. She had learned that begging gave men power, and pleading gave them pleasure, and neither one got you free. What she did was calculate, the same way she calculated everything. Risk and reward, cost and benefit, the mathematics of survival. "I cost less than that horse, mister, and I work harder." Her voice was flat. A ledger entry. She was selling her usefulness because usefulness was the only currency she had and the only shield she knew. A tool gets maintained. A person gets discarded. She had learned that at Cyrus's table, and she was not above using it now. The rancher looked at her. Then he looked at the horse through the barn slats. Then he looked back at her. He walked inside. Clara heard him set something on the counter, something heavy, wood and metal. She heard Griggs make a sound, a short, pleased sound, the sound a man makes when he gets what he wanted. Then the rancher came back into the yard. He was carrying a small iron key, and his back looked different, lighter, like he had set down something he had been carrying for a very long time. He walked toward her slow, hands open where she could see them. He stopped 3 feet away and knelt in the dirt. "I am going to unlock this chain. That is all. Nothing else." She did not answer, but she watched his hands. They were steady, scarred across the knuckles, working hands. And they trembled, not with fear, but with something else. Grief, maybe. The weight of whatever he had just set on that counter. The key turned rough in the crude lock. The chain dropped into the dirt with a sound like a dead snake hitting rock. Clara pulled her wrist to her chest and held it against her ribs. The raw skin wept. She made no sound. The rancher stood up. He took 2 full steps back. She noted the distance. 2 steps back instead of 1 step forward. That was a language she had never heard a man speak before. They walked through the trading post. Clara kept her eyes on the rancher's hands, and on the exits, and on the 3 men by the fence who stopped talking to watch them pass. She catalogued everything. And as they went through the gate, she saw him. Lyle Denton, standing at the far corner of the fence, thin, tall, hat cocked to one side, one of Cyrus's men. He had been watching the whole time. He did not speak. He did not need to. He mounted his horse and rode east. East was where Cyrus lived. She did not know the rancher's name yet. She knew 2 things about him. He had given up something that mattered, and the man at the fence was already riding east to tell someone she was gone. She asked his name at the 1-mile mark and did not speak again until the 3rd. By then he understood she was not being rude. She was deciding whether his answer had been true. Elias Boone. That was all he gave her. 2 words. She gave him 1. Clara. No last name. He did not ask for one. The road north was rutted dirt between sagebrush flats. July heat pressed down like a hand. Juniper walked slow and steady, favoring her left foreleg on the rough patches. And Clara rode with the ease of someone who had been on horseback since she was old enough to grip a saddle horn. She held the reins in her good hand and pressed the wounded wrist against her stomach, and she did not complain about the heat or the dust or the distance or anything at all. Elias walked beside the mare and tried not to think about the empty space on his back where Thomas's rifle used to ride. The muscle memory was still there. His hand kept reaching for it every few minutes, finding nothing, dropping back. 23 years of that weight, gone in a handshake with Marlowe Griggs. The wood had been warm from his body when he set it on the counter. The carved letters had caught the light one last time, and then Griggs's thick fingers had closed over them, and Thomas's rifle became Griggs's rifle. And that was the end of something Elias did not have words for. He had done the math in his head 100 times on the walk to Griggs's place. $18 and the Winchester for a horse that could work. That was the equation. That was the smart choice. That was survival. Then he saw a girl chained to a fence post with flies on her bare feet, and 2 crooked fingers that had healed wrong, and a row of round scars on her forearm that he recognized as cigar burns, because he had seen the same marks on men in prisoner of war camps during the war, and the equation changed. The equation changed, and he hated it because the new math was simple and terrible. The horse saves the ranch. The girl, he did not know what the girl did. He did not know if she could work or cook or mend fence or do any of the things he needed done to keep this land alive. He did not know her name or her story or why she was chained in Griggs's yard. All he knew was that Thomas had carved his initials into that rifle stock 23 years ago, laughing about what the Confederates might do. And Thomas had died at 17 in a cornfield with his mouth moving and no sound coming out. And if Thomas were standing in that auction yard, he would not have bought the horse. Thomas would not have bought the horse because Thomas was the kind of person who saw a wrong thing and could not leave it wrong. That was what made him good. That was what got him killed. And Elias had spent 23 years carrying the rifle of a boy who was better than him, and it seemed fitting that giving it up was the price of doing what that boy would have done. So he gave up the rifle and the money and the horse and the last thread that connected him to his dead brother, and he walked out of Griggs's trading post with nothing except a lame mare and a girl he did not know, and the beginning of something that scared him more than poverty, which was responsibility for another human being. Clara asked 3 questions in 14 miles. What is your name? How far? Anyone else there? Each one came after a silence long enough to count. Each one was delivered in that same flat voice, the ledger voice, the voice of a woman for whom words were currency, and she did not spend more than the transaction required. Elias recognized it because he spoke the same language. 14 years alone on a ranch teaches you that words cost something, and you do not throw them around any more than you throw around dollars. Between questions, Clara watched the land. He could see her eyes moving even from below. She tracked the sun. She noted the creek crossings. She looked at the ridge lines and the trail forks and the rock formations, the way a soldier looks at terrain, reading it for advantage and escape. She was building a map in her head, mapping every way off this land before she even set foot on it. Elias recognized that too. He would have done the same thing. The ranch came into view past a low ridge, cabin with a warped porch, barn with a sagging roof, corral fence broken in 6 places, creek running thin along the south line, 3 chickens scratching in the hard-packed yard. Clara looked at it for a long time from the saddle. Her face did not change, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted. Not relaxation, something smaller, like a wire that had been pulled taut for 4 years, easing back a single notch. Quiet, she said. Not a judgment, not a complaint, just a word. But the way she said it carried the weight of a woman who had lived in a house where something was always breaking. Someone was always yelling, dogs barking, bottles smashing, and the absence of all that noise was not silence to her. It was oxygen. Bed is inside, Elias said. Room is yours. I sleep in the barn. Clara looked at him. Hard. Measuring. Reading his hands and his stance and the distance between them the way she had been reading everything since the auction yard. Then she slid off the saddle without help and walked to the cabin door and went inside and closed it behind her. Elias stood in the yard and looked at that closed door. It had been open for 14 years. He had left it open because there was no one to close it and no reason to bother. Now it was closed because a girl he had known for 3 hours had shut it from the inside. And that simple act, a hand on a door pulled shut, the sound of a latch catching, was the first time in 14 years that someone had been inside his home and wanted the privacy of a closed door. And he was on the outside of it. He unsaddled Juniper, hung the bridle on a nail in the barn, sat on a hay bale with his skinning knife on his knee and his back against the stall wall, and looked east through the barn door at the road that led to Griggs's place, and beyond Griggs's place to wherever Cyrus Whitlock lived. Lyle Denton had ridden east 4 hours ago. Fast rider on a fresh horse could make the Whitlock claim in 2 hours. Cyrus would know by now. Clara was gone. The man who took her was a broke rancher named Boone, who lived 14 miles north with no money, no rifle, and no friends. Elias sat in the barn and did not sleep. He listened to the wind push through the gaps in the wall. He listened to the coyotes calling back and forth across the valley. He listened to the creek running low and slow over smooth rocks. And sometime after midnight, very faintly, he heard the sound of even breathing from the cabin. She was asleep. 3 hours after meeting a stranger, chained and bleeding and starved, she had fallen asleep in his bed. Elias did not know if that was trust or exhaustion. He suspected exhaustion. The body does not care what the mind thinks when it has been pushed far enough. He had learned that at Antietam, where men slept in shallow ditches between artillery barrages because flesh and bone eventually override fear. The body shuts down when it needs to, whether the mind gives permission or not. He sat in the dark and held his skinning knife and watched the east road. Somewhere east, a lamp burned in Cyrus Whitlock's kitchen. A man was talking. Cyrus was listening. And Cyrus Whitlock was a man who listened with great care before he did terrible things. Clara checked the door before dawn. Unlocked. She checked it again at first light. Still unlocked. She would check it 9 more times before she understood that it was never going to be locked, and that understanding would take longer to believe than anything Cyrus had ever done to her. The cabin was clean but spare. A table made of rough-cut pine, 1 chair, a wood stove with an iron top that had been blacked and maintained with the care of a man who understood that a stove was not furniture but survival, a bed with a thin wool blanket, and a straw mattress that smelled like dust and sage and, faintly, very faintly, like the man who had slept on it for 14 years. Under the bed, pushed against the wall, was a small wooden box with a brass latch. Clara noted it the way she noted everything, catalogued it, filed it, and did not touch it. Other people's private things were not her business. She had learned that lesson early. At Cyrus's house, touching something that was not yours earned consequences that left marks. She explored the cabin in the gray light before sunrise. There was food on a shelf, hardtack, dried beef, a tin of coffee, a bag of cornmeal. Not much. The provisions of a man who ate to function, not to enjoy. She found a kitchen knife in a drawer. Good steel, sharp, recently honed. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight, and then put it back. Not yet. Maybe not at all. But she knew where it was. Footsteps outside. Her body reacted before her mind did. Shoulders tight, breath held. Eyes on the door. The old pattern. Footsteps meant someone was coming, and someone coming meant something bad. And something bad meant you braced yourself and waited for it to land. But the footsteps stopped at the door frame, not at the door, which was open. At the frame. And then a voice, quiet, careful, pitched low enough that she would have to choose to listen. Clara. I'm going to start a fire out here for coffee. There is hard tack and dried beef on the shelf if you are hungry. I am not coming inside. She stood behind the door and watched through the gap where the hinge met the frame. Elias Boone was standing on the porch with his back to her, looking out at the yard. His hands were at his sides, open, empty, visible. He had not leaned forward. He had not tried to see in. He had stopped at the threshold and announced himself and offered food and promised not to enter. And then he stood there waiting for nothing. Clara watched him walk to the fire pit in the yard. He knelt and built a fire with the efficient motions of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He filled a tin pot with water from the creek and set it on the stones to boil. He took 2 tin cups from a shelf on the outside of the cabin wall and set them on the porch rail. Then he sat on the ground with his back against the porch post, facing away from the door, and waited. Every pattern she had learned in 4 years with Cyrus, this man inverted. Cyrus stood in doorways. This man stood outside them. Cyrus kept his hands where she could not see them, behind his back, under the table, in his pockets, because hidden hands held power, and power was what Cyrus traded in. This man kept his hands open and visible at all times. Cyrus moved toward. This man moved away. Cyrus stood between her and exits. This man never positioned himself between her and open ground. He was speaking a language she had no translation for, the language of space given freely with nothing expected in return. She did not know what to do with it. She did not know if it was real. In her experience, kindness was either currency or camouflage, something a man spent to get something back or something a man wore to hide what he was really doing. But the fire was burning, and the water was heating, and the cups were on the rail, and the man was sitting with his back to her, looking at the mountains. And that was all that was happening. Nothing else. No angle, no setup, no trap she could see. Clara stepped out onto the porch. Elias did not turn around. He heard her footsteps on the boards, 3 careful steps, each one placed with deliberation, and he poured coffee into both cups, and set one on the step beside him and picked up the other and drank from it, and did not look at her. She picked up the cup. The coffee was black and bitter and hot, and it was the first warm thing she had held in 3 days that was not a cigar burn. They did not speak. The silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence between 2 people who understood that quiet could be a gift if you let it be, and both of them had enough experience with noise to appreciate its absence. After the coffee, Elias stood and said he was going to work on the fence. Clara watched him walk to the corral with a hammer and a bag of nails and a post he had cut from a cottonwood down by the creek. He worked alone for about an hour. Then Clara walked out and stood beside the fence and said, "I can help." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything else about it. He handed her the end of a wire, and she held the post steady while he drove it. And that was how the first day began. Not with a conversation, not with a declaration, with a fence post and a hammer, and 2 people working side by side, who both understood that work was easier than words and results were easier than promises. She was stronger than she looked, wiry, efficient, no wasted motion. She handled the wire with bare hands and did not flinch when it bit into her palms. She selected timber by sight, eyeballing the straight ones and discarding the warped ones without being told. She knew angles, she knew load-bearing structures. She knew how to brace a post so it held weight instead of shifting under it. "Who taught you?" Elias said. "My stepdaddy. Amos. He was a good man." Pause. Before he died. Nothing more. Elias did not press. Some doors you do not walk through until you are invited, and that door was closed. In the afternoon, Elias walked the property with Clara. He showed her the creek crossing where the water was shallow enough to wade even in spring runoff. The ridge trail that looped behind the cabin and came out near the east road. The rock outcrop on the north side where a person could see 2 miles in every direction. The root cellar behind the barn. Cool, dark, invisible from the road. Clara memorized everything. She did not ask him to repeat himself. She asked questions. Smart ones. Where does the creek go if I follow it south? Who owns the land on the other side of the ridge? What is the fastest way to the marshal's office on foot? He was giving her escape routes. She knew it. He knew she knew it. Neither of them named it because naming it would have required talking about why a woman might need escape routes from the man who had just unchained her, and neither of them was ready for that conversation yet. That evening, Clara went inside and came back carrying the thin wool blanket from the bed. She walked to the barn and hung it over the rail of the nearest stall without a word, and went back inside. Elias stood in the yard looking at the blanket. His back had been screaming since dawn from sleeping on hay bales. She had noticed. She had not asked about it. She had not said anything about it. She had simply seen a problem and addressed it with the minimum number of words, which was 0. It was the first time in 14 years someone had done something for him without being asked. He did not know what to do with that. So he did the only thing he knew how to do with feelings he could not name. He folded them up and put them away and went back to work. That night, she left the cabin door open. Not because she trusted Elias Boone, because she wanted to hear him if he moved. And because for the first time in 4 years, the sound she heard through an open door was not footsteps coming closer. It was a man sitting still. While Clara listened to Elias not moving, and Elias listened to Clara breathing 10 miles east, Cyrus Whitlock sat in the marshal's office in town. He wore a clean shirt. His hair was combed. His voice was measured and polite, and carried the particular authority of a man who had loaned money to half the people in the room. He filed a formal complaint. Elias Boone had taken his indentured ward from Griggs's trading post without consent. He presented documents. A will bearing the full signature of Amos Dunn, clean handwriting, properly witnessed. A bill of indenture with Clara's signature at the bottom. He presented both papers to Alderman Vernon Stroud, the local justice of the peace, who owed Cyrus $300 and who reviewed the documents with the careful neutrality of a man whose debts made neutrality impossible. Consistent with territorial law, Stroud said. Marshal Tom Briggs took the complaint. He would ride out to Boone's ranch in the morning. "One more thing," Cyrus said as he stood to leave. "If Boone or the girl claims the will is forged, I have 3 men who witnessed Amos signing it. Tom Hadley, Reuben Finch, old Garrett Slade. All 3 will swear to it." Briggs nodded. Stroud nodded. Cyrus walked out into the evening air and mounted his horse and rode east, and the only sign that anything was wrong with him was the way his hands shook slightly on the reins, a tremor he could not quite control no matter how steady he kept his voice. His laudanum supply had been cut off 3 months ago. The doctor in the town 40 miles south who used to sell to him had stopped. Something about new regulations. Something about conscience. Cyrus did not care about the reason. He cared about the shaking in his hands that got worse every night and the pain in his lower back that the laudanum used to smooth out, and that now sat in his spine like a hot wire that no amount of whiskey could cool. He rode home in the dark and sat in his kitchen and looked at the photograph of Amos on the wall and said nothing to it. Not yet. That conversation would come later when the shaking got worse and the girl was still gone and the world he had built started coming apart at the seams. Margaret Yates rode in with a shotgun across her saddle in the kind of expression that meant the news was bad and the shotgun was relevant. She was 55 years old, a preacher's widow who ran the dry goods store in town with the efficiency of a woman who had spent 22 years watching her husband make decisions and had spent the 3 years since his death making her own. Reverend Yates had not been a cruel man. He had never hit her, never chained her, never burned her. But he had controlled every dollar, every decision, every social interaction for 22 years until Margaret could not remember what her own opinions sounded like. There was more than one kind of cage. Margaret knew that the way she knew her own name, and when word reached her about a girl chained in Griggs's auction yard, she heard the lock click in a way that men never seemed to hear. She pulled up 20 feet from the porch and did not dismount. Clara was in the doorway. Elias was in the yard. "Boone," Margaret said, "word in town is you bought a girl from Griggs's yard." "I did not buy her. I got her out. That is not the story going around." Margaret's eyes moved to Clara. She studied her the way women study each other when the stakes are high, not the surface but the structure underneath, the posture, the hands, the way the eyes moved. She saw the bandaged wrist, the crooked fingers, the torn dress, the bare feet. "Lyle Denton has been in the saloon since last night telling everybody you paid $30 for a Whitlock girl and took her home. Half the town thinks you bought yourself a wife. Other half thinks worse. I do not care what the town thinks. You should. Because Cyrus Whitlock was in the marshal's office this morning, filed a complaint, says you stole his indentured ward, says he has got a bill of sale and a will and 3 witnesses." Clara stepped forward off the porch. Her voice was steady. "What witnesses?" Margaret looked at her. "Tom Hadley, Reuben Finch, Garrett Slade. All 3 say they watched Amos Dunn sign the will that gave Cyrus guardianship." Clara's jaw tightened. She went quiet in the way that Elias was beginning to recognize meant she was not retreating but calculating, running the numbers, checking the angles. "Amos could not write," Clara said. The silence that followed had weight. Elias felt it settle on the porch like a physical thing. "My stepdaddy signed everything with an X. Every deed, every receipt, every prescription Doc Harlan ever wrote for him. If that will has a full signature, Cyrus forged it." Margaret was already shaking her head. "I believe you, girl. But Cyrus has those 3 men lined up to say otherwise. Hadley owes him money. Finch owes him favors. Slade owes him both. They will stand up in front of the marshal and swear on whatever book you put in front of them that Amos learned to write in his last year, their word against yours. Clara looked at Elias. He looked back. The math was simple and bad. A 20-year-old girl with no standing in the community against a landowner with 3 witnesses and a justice of the peace in his pocket. Paper beats people every time, in a world where the people holding the paper have more money than the people on it. But Clara was not finished calculating. Dr. Harlan treated Amos for 2 years before he died. He wrote every prescription, filled out every treatment record. Amos signed all of them with his mark, an X. If those records are dated, and they should be, they prove Amos could not write in the same years Cyrus claims he signed that will. Margaret nodded slowly. That is your evidence. Harlan's records against Cyrus's witnesses. Dated documents against paid liars. There was a problem and everybody knew it before anyone said it. Harlan is Confederate, Elias said. Margaret looked at him. Former Confederate, 12th Georgia. He served as a field surgeon, lost his brother at Antietam. Elias's face did not change, but something behind it shifted. A door opening onto a room he had kept locked for 23 years. You two have lived in the same town for 14 years, Margaret said. Have you ever spoken? No. Well, tonight would be a good time to start. Harlan's medical records are the only thing that can prove the will is forged. Without them, it is Clara's word against Cyrus's paper, and paper wins. Margaret reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a wrapped bundle. She set it on the porch rail. Salt pork, cornmeal, a jar of honey, and a pair of brown leather boots, worn soft but solid. These were my daughter's, Margaret said. She is about your size. Clara looked at the bundle, then at Margaret. Why? Clara asked. Because I was married to a man who thought he owned me for 22 years, and because somebody needs to say out loud that Marlowe Griggs is a son of a bitch. Clara picked up the boots. She sat on the porch step and pulled them on. They fit. She stood up, took 3 steps on the boards, stopped, stood very still. Her face did not change, but her breathing went shallow and her jaw locked, and she turned away from both of them so they would not see whatever was happening in her eyes. Elias looked at the mountains. Margaret looked at the sky. They gave her the 30 seconds she needed, and nobody said a word about it. Clara, Elias said, I am fine. I know you are fine. I was going to say Margaret is right about Harlan. I need to ride to town tonight. Clara turned back. Whatever had happened in her face was locked away again, stored somewhere safe where it could not be used against her. Go, she said. I will be here when you get back. It was the first time she had said anything that sounded like a promise. Elias saddled Juniper and rode south toward town in the late light. Clara stood in the yard and watched him go until he was a shape against the heat shimmer, and then nothing. Then she went inside and sat on the bed and pulled the boots tight and laced them, and sat there in the fading light with her feet on the floor in boots that fit. And for the first time in 4 years, she felt the ground under her like something solid, instead of something that might open up at any second. Doc Harlan Webb's office was on the 2nd floor of the building next to the livery stable. The stairs were outside, wooden, steep, and they creaked under Elias's boots in a way that announced visitors whether they wanted to be announced or not. The door was open. The office smelled like carbolic acid and bourbon, which was either a medical practice or a philosophy. Harlan was at his desk with a glass in his hand and a lamp burning low. He was 60 years old, thin, white hair cut short, blue eyes that had seen too much and compensated by seeing everything with a clinical precision that substituted for warmth. He looked up when Elias appeared in the doorway. Boone, he said. First course. Yeah. Silence. The kind that stretches between 2 men who have spent 24 years on opposite sides of a war that ended and did not end at the same time. I had a brother at Antietam, Harlan said. 12th Georgia. Samuel Webb Harlan. He was 20. Elias leaned against the doorframe. I had one too. First Corps, Thomas Boone. He was 17. Another silence. Two men looking at each other across a gap that was not measured in feet, but in years and flags and cornfields full of smoke, and the particular grief of men who came home from a war carrying someone who did not. Harlan set down his glass. "What do you need, Boone?" Elias told him. The girl, Griggs's yard, Cyrus Whitlock, the will, the indenture, the 3 false witnesses, and the one thing that could unravel all of it. Amos Dunn could not write his name. You treated him for 2 years. You wrote his prescriptions. He signed with an X. I need those records. Harlan was quiet for a long time. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. He flipped through pages, stopped, turned the book around so Elias could see. 2 years of entries. Patient name, Amos Dunn. Date, treatment, medication, dosage, and at the bottom of every entry, in the space marked patient signature, a single letter. X, over and over. 2 years of X marks in a hand that trembled slightly, the hand of a man who could manage 1 letter but not 26. Harlan closed the book. Amos Dunn could not write his name. I would testify to that in any court in the territory. But, Harlan said, and the word hung in the air the way a but always does when the news is about to get worse. Stroud will not accept my testimony alone. He is in Cyrus's pocket. You need this in front of a territorial judge, not a county justice of the peace. That means Cheyenne. That means time. How much time? Judge rides circuit. 3-4 days minimum to get him here, if you can get word to him. Elias did not have 3 or 4 days. He might not have 3 or 4 hours. Harlan closed the ledger and set it on the desk. There is something else I can do. Let me examine the girl, document her injuries, burns, fractures, scarring, whatever Cyrus did to her. A formal medical record, dated, signed by me. That is evidence that stands in any courtroom regardless of what Stroud says. She will not let a stranger touch her. Then I will not touch her. I will look. I will document. I will record what I see from a medical distance. She does not have to let me close. She just has to let me see. Elias picked up the ledger. I will ask her. I am not making promises for her. She decides. Fair enough. Elias rode home in the dark with the medical records in his saddlebag and a Confederate doctor's word in his pocket, and he thought about the world and how it made no sense at all that the man who might save Clara was the same kind of man who had killed Thomas, and that maybe the war had taken enough from both of them that the sides did not matter anymore. Maybe they never had. The rider came from the west, not the east, and that was the only reason Clara did not go for the kitchen knife before she saw the woman's face. Clara was alone at the ranch. Elias was still in town. The sun had gone down an hour ago, and the dark had filled the valley the way water fills a bowl, rising from the low places first, and then swallowing everything. Every sound was louder. Every shadow had weight. The creek sounded different at night, more like a whisper than a murmur, like it was trying to tell her something she could not quite make out. She was sitting on the porch with the kitchen knife in her lap when she heard the horse, not from the east where Cyrus lived, from the west, coming slow. A tired horse carrying a rider who was not in a hurry, which meant either someone who was not a threat or someone who wanted to look like they were not a threat. The rider came out of the dark and stopped at the edge of the yard. An old woman on a tired horse, thin, sunken eyes, hands gripping the reins with the tremor of someone who was either very cold or very dependent on something that made the trembling stop. Clara knew her. Not well. Not by name. But she had seen her at a distance from Cyrus's property. She lived 3 miles to the west. Sometimes Clara could hear her chickens in the early morning when the wind was right. The woman did not dismount. She spoke from the saddle like someone who was afraid that if she got off the horse, she would not have the courage to say what she came to say. Girl, I came to tell you something. Cyrus is not waiting for the marshal. He told my boy Holt tonight. They are coming. Clara stood up. The knife was in her hand but at her side, not raised. "Why are you telling me?" The woman looked at her hands, raw, shaking. She was Marin Denton, mother of Lyle and Holt and Webb. The tremor was laudanum withdrawal. Clara recognized it because she had seen the same tremor in Cyrus's hands over the past 3 months, getting worse every week. "Because I have been living 3 miles from that house for 4 years. I heard you crying through the windows on summer nights when the wind came right. And I did not do a damn thing about it." Silence. "I am not here because I am good. I am here because I cannot carry it no more." Clara looked at this woman who had heard a girl crying for 4 years and had done nothing. Not because she was evil, because she was weak, because she was afraid. Because doing something meant losing her laudanum supply and her son's loyalty, and whatever thin thread of stability held her collapsing life together. Clara did not forgive her. Forgiveness was not what this woman had come for and not what Clara had to give. What she gave was something smaller and harder. She nodded once. Acknowledgement. "I hear you. I know what it cost you to come here. I am not ready to say it was enough. You should leave before your boys know you came," Clara said. Marin Denton turned her horse and rode back into the dark, and Clara stood in the yard with a kitchen knife and the information that Cyrus was coming tonight, and Elias was not here. She could run. She knew every trail on this property. Elias had shown her all of them. The creek crossing, the ridge trail, the rock outcrop with the 2-mile sightline. She could be 5 miles away before anyone knew she was gone. She could disappear into the dark and keep going and never look back and start over somewhere, anywhere, in any direction. She was calculating the routes when she heard the second horse. Coming from the south, the town road. Fast. Clara grabbed the knife and pressed her back against the wall beside the door. The horse stopped, boots on the porch, heavy, a man's stride. And then the footsteps stopped and she heard a voice she recognized speaking to someone she could not see. Not loudly. Just the low murmur of a conversation happening on the porch between 2 men. One of them Elias, and one of them someone else. And then she heard it. The clink of coins, metal changing hands, the distinctive sound of money being paid. Her mind did what it had been trained to do for 4 years. It found the worst possible interpretation and locked onto it like a hand closing around a rope. "He is selling information about me. He found a buyer, a different buyer, a better price." 4 years of learned pattern recognition overrode 2 days of evidence. Every man who had ever shown Clara kindness had revealed a price. Every gift came with a hook. Every open hand eventually closed. This was the pattern. This was the truth. This was the only story she knew. She ran. Out the back door, through the yard, into the creek bed. The water was cold around her ankles, and the rocks were slick, but she moved fast because fear makes you fast. And Clara had been afraid for 4 years, and her body knew how to run the way a river knows how to find the sea. She took the north trail, the one Elias had shown her, up the ridge, through the scrub pine. The stars were bright enough to see the path if you knew where to look, and Clara knew because she had memorized every step that afternoon. She climbed hard. Her lungs burned. The boots Margaret had given her gripped the rocky trail, and for one terrible, grateful, contradictory second, she thought about how much easier it was to run in boots that fit. She made it to the rock outcrop, the one with the 2-mile sightline. She sat with her back against the rock and her knife in her hand, and she breathed, hard, ragged, the kind of breathing that is not about oxygen but about the body trying to outrun the mind. The adrenaline peaked and began to fade, and as it faded, the logic came back, slow, reluctant, like a guest arriving at a party they did not want to attend. If he wanted to sell me, why did he show me every way off this land? The thought sat in her chest like a stone. Why did he give me the map to leave him? She did not trust Elias Boone. She had known him for 2 days, and trust was not something Clara built in 2 days or 2 months or possibly ever. But she trusted the logic of his actions, and the logic did not fit the story her fear had written. A man who plans to sell you does not teach you every escape route on his property. A man who plans to betray you does not hand you the tools to leave. What actually happened was this. Elias had stopped on the road south of the ranch when he passed a freight hauler heading toward Rawlins. He paid the man 3 of his last remaining coins to carry a letter to the telegraph office. The letter was a message to the territorial judge in Cheyenne, requesting an emergency hearing in the matter of Clara Dunn and Cyrus Whitlock. That was the conversation Clara had heard. That was the coins. A man paying a stranger to carry a piece of paper that might save a girl's life. But Clara could not have known that. She heard what she heard, and her mind filled in the gaps with the only story it had ever been told. And she ran because running is what you do when the pattern matches, and the pattern has never been wrong before. Except this time, it was wrong. Clara sat on the rock outcrop for a long time. The stars turned overhead. A coyote called from the south ridge, and another answered from the east. And the space between those two sounds was the loneliest thing in Wyoming. She looked at the knife in her hand. She looked at the dark trail leading south back to the ranch. She looked at the dark trail leading north away from everything. She stood up and walked south. An hour later, she was standing on the porch. Elias was sitting on the step with his skinning knife on his knee, exactly where she had found him. He had not followed her. He had not searched. He had not yelled her name into the dark. He had sat down and waited because he told her she could leave and he would not come after her, and the only way to prove a promise is to keep it when keeping it costs you something. "I came back," Clara said. "I see that," Elias said. He did not ask why she ran. She did not explain. He went inside and came back with a strip of clean cloth and a canteen and the news from Doc Harlan. They sat on the porch step, farther apart than yesterday, but still on the same porch. And he told her about the medical records and about Harlan and about the letter to Cheyenne. And then she told him, "Cyrus is coming tonight. Marin Denton was here. She said he told Holt. They are coming." Elias sat still for a moment. His hand found the empty space on his back where the Winchester used to ride. Muscle memory reaching for something that was gone. How many? Clara counted in her head. Cyrus, Lyle, Holt, Webb, maybe Stroud. 4 or 5. Elias looked east. The road was a dark line between darker hills. He loaded the skinning knife and the hatchet onto the porch rail. Clara sat beside him and looked east. They had maybe 3 hours. They had no rifle, no help, and a trust between them that was cracked but holding, the way a bone holds after a fracture, weaker at the break, weaker at the young, but harder everywhere else. They came from the east the way Clara said they would, at the hour she said they would, in the pattern she said they would. The only thing she got wrong was that there were 5 of them, not 4. The sound reached them first, hooves on packed dirt, moving careful, not fast. Men who were trying to be quiet and almost succeeding. Clara heard it from the porch where she sat with the hatchet across her knees. She counted the horses by the rhythm. 4, maybe 5. Too many. East, she said. One word. Low. Elias was in the barn doorway, 40 yards away. He heard her. The dark was thick, but not total. Starlight gave the land a faint silver wash, and shapes moved against it if you knew where to look. Clara knew where to look. She had spent 4 years watching Cyrus organize exactly this kind of approach. Lyle first, talking. The brothers flanking. Cyrus behind, waiting. She knew the pattern the way she knew her own heartbeat. A shadow separated from the tree line by the creek, then a second farther south, then a third angling north toward the barn, and behind them 2 more hanging back near the road. 5, not 4. Lyle Denton's voice cut through the dark, loud, almost cheerful. The voice of a man who had been given a simple job and wanted to get it done and go home. "Boone. Hey, Boone. You awake in there? Cyrus just wants to talk. That is all. Just a conversation between reasonable men." Clara did not move. She sat on the porch with the hatchet across her knees and watched Lyle walk closer. 50 yards, 40, 30. Elias is in the cabin, Lyle, Clara called out. Her voice was steady, flat, the Ledger voice. Lyle stopped. He had not expected her. Well, look who has got a voice. Clara May. Almost did not recognize you without the chain. Almost did not recognize you without Cyrus telling you what to say. Lyle took another step. 20 yards. She could see his shape now. Tall, thin. Something in his right hand that caught the starlight. A pistol. Behind Lyle, the flanking shadows moved. One toward the barn. That would be Holt. One along the south side of the corral, circling behind the cabin. Webb, probably. And the two by the road. Cyrus and Alderman Stroud. Stroud was the fifth man. Clara understood immediately what that meant. Cyrus had brought the law with him. Not real law, bought law. But a justice of the peace with a piece of paper was enough to make violence look legal in the dark. "Where is Boone?" Lyle said. "Around," Clara said. "That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting." From the road, a new voice. Thin, nervous, Stroud. "I have a recovery order signed by the county justice of the peace. Miss Whitlock is to be returned to the custody of her legal guardian, Cyrus Whitlock, immediately. Any interference will be considered obstruction of a lawful order." Clara's stomach dropped, but her face did not change. She had learned a long time ago that the face was the last thing you let them see. "My name is Dunn," Clara said. "Not Whitlock. And that paper is not worth the match it would take to burn it." Holt Denton kicked in the back door of the cabin. The crash split the night. Wood splintering, hinges screaming, Clara was already on her feet, already turning, the hatchet in her hand. But Holt was not in the cabin. He was coming through the cabin fast, and he came out the front door like a bull through a gate, short, wide, face like something carved from bad rock and left unfinished. He had a knife in each hand. "Hello, Clara." Cyrus says hello. Clara swung the hatchet. Fast, hard, the way a person swings when they have spent 4 years imagining what they would do if they ever had a weapon and the chance to use it. The blade caught Holt's left forearm and opened a gash that went deep enough to see white before the blood filled it. He howled, dropped one knife, but Holt was the dangerous one. Clara had told Elias that. Holt did not stop when he was hurt. He got angry. He lunged. His remaining knife caught the air where Clara's face had been half a second before she ducked. His other hand, the bleeding one, closed on her hair and pulled. She went down, hit the porch boards hard. The hatchet skittered away. Elias came around the corner of the barn at a dead run. He hit Holt with the hatchet handle across the back of the skull. Not the blade. The handle. A driving blow that sent Holt sideways into the porch rail. The rail cracked. Holt went down. But while Elias was dealing with Holt, Lyle had moved. He grabbed Clara from behind, arms around her waist, lifting. She fought, bit his forearm, kicked. But Lyle had 60 pounds on her, and fear makes a man strong, the same way it makes a woman fast. Webb brought the horses up. They were dragging Clara toward the animals when Elias turned and saw it and started running. Cyrus Whitlock stepped out of the dark. He was smaller than Elias expected, narrow-shouldered, thin-faced, hollow cheeks and glassy eyes. The eyes of a man who had not had laudanum in too many days, and whose body was turning on him in ways he could not control. His hands shook, but the shotgun they held did not need steady hands at 15 feet. Elias had a hatchet. At 15 feet, a hatchet loses to a shotgun every single time. Cyrus did not shoot. He drove the stock of the shotgun forward like a battering ram. It caught Elias across the face. The impact was sound and light, and a crack that went through his skull like a bell being struck. He went down, hit the dirt, hard, felt his ribs crack on the left side, 2 of them, the sharp, specific pain of bone giving way. Blood filled his left eye from a gash above the brow. The world went half dark. From the road, Stroud's voice, high and frightened but saying the words, "This is a lawful recovery. I have a legal order." "This is lawful." Clara was on Lyle's horse. Lyle mounted behind her. Webb had already turned east. Holt was being dragged upright by Cyrus, who kicked him until he moved. They rode east. The hoofbeats faded. The dust settled. Elias pushed himself up on one arm. Blood filled his left eye. The east road was dark and empty and silent. She was gone. He had done the only right thing he had ever done since the cornfield, and it had not been enough. Again. 7 boards across, 12 boards long, same ceiling, same room, same lock on the door, same boards on the windows. Clara counted them the way she had counted flies in Griggs's yard. Not because the numbers mattered, but because counting was the thing you did instead of screaming. She was back. The room smelled the same. Dust and kerosene, and the sour undertone of a house where a man had been slowly poisoning himself for years. The window boards were the same rough-cut pine Cyrus had nailed up when she was 17, the week after her first escape attempt. He told her it was for warmth. It was not for warmth. But Clara was not the same person who had last sat on this bed. She knew that the way she knew the number of boards on the ceiling. Something had shifted in the 3 days since the auction yard. Not a lot. Not enough to call it change. But enough. She had stood on a porch with an open door. She had drunk coffee in the morning from a tin cup, while a man sat with his back to her and did not turn around. She had worn boots that fit and felt the ground under her like something solid. She had memorized every trail on a piece of land where someone had given her the map and did not follow when she used it. Cyrus could lock her body in this room. He could not erase what she now knew was possible. He came in that night, not to hurt her, to talk. That was how Cyrus operated. The violence was for enforcement. The talking was for control. He sat in the chair across from the bed and spoke in that calm, measured voice that never rose above conversational. You see what happened, Clara. He could not protect you. Nobody can protect you. Not Boone, not anyone. The world does not work that way. Come back to work. Things will be like they were. Clara said nothing. Cyrus waited. He was patient. He had always been patient. That was the thing people did not understand about him. He was not a man who lost his temper and broke things. He was a man who waited until the silence became unbearable and then filled it with whatever he wanted you to believe. But Clara had learned something about silence in the past 3 days. She had learned that silence could be a gift if the right person was sitting in it with you. And she had learned that her own silence could be a weapon if she held it steady and let the other person's need to fill it work against them. She said nothing. Cyrus waited. Clara waited longer. He left the room. Late that night, she heard him in the kitchen. Through the crack under the door, she could see the lamplight flickering, and she could see his shadow hunched at the table. His hands were shaking worse than she had ever seen them. The laudanum withdrawal was eating him from the inside. 3 months without supply. His body was demanding something his will could not provide, and the gap between those two things was widening every day. He was looking at the photograph of Amos on the wall. His brother, Clara's stepdaddy. The decent man who had died and left a silence that Cyrus had filled with cruelty. Cyrus spoke to the photograph. His voice was low. Not the measured voice, something rawer. You left her to me, Amos. You did not say what to do with her, nothing more. He put his head in his hands. Clara watched through the crack and felt nothing. Not pity, not satisfaction, not anger, nothing. And that nothing was its own kind of freedom, because for 4 years Cyrus had been the center of her emotional world, the source of every fear and every calculation, and every waking moment devoted to reading his mood and anticipating his violence. And now, she was watching him fall apart, and she felt nothing at all. He was becoming irrelevant. And irrelevance was worse than hatred, because hatred means someone still matters. She worked a shard of glass loose from the corner of the boarded window. It took an hour of quiet, careful pressure. She hid it in the hem of her dress, not to hurt herself, not to hurt Cyrus, to cut rope if she needed to. Tools, options, escape routes, the things Elias had taught her to value. 10 miles west, Elias Boone was lying on Doc Harlan's examination table trying to breathe without moving his ribs. Two cracked, left side. The eye was swollen shut. The gash above the brow closed with 3 stitches that Harlan placed with the efficient detachment of a man who had sewn up worse in field hospitals during the war. Multiple contusions. A bruise on his jaw the size and color of a rotten plum. "You cannot ride for 4 days," Harlan said. "Minimum. I have got 2. Then you will fall off the horse halfway there and die in a ditch. Then I fall off the horse and die in a ditch." Harlan set down his instruments. He looked at Elias the way a doctor looks at a patient who is not being stupid, but who is being something worse, which is determined. "Why?" Harlan said. The words sat in the room like a rock in a stream. Simple, immovable, requiring a response. Elias was quiet for a long time. The pain in his ribs made every breath a conscious decision. And conscious breathing has a way of stripping away the things you usually hide behind. "Thomas was running toward me," Elias said. Harlan went still. "At Antietam, in the cornfield, September 17th. Thomas was beside me when the line broke. The smoke was so thick you could not see 10 feet. He got separated. I heard him call my name. I turned and I saw him running toward me through the smoke." Elias stopped. The words were coming from a place he had kept locked for 23 years, and the lock was rusted, and the door was stiff, and everything behind it smelled like old blood and gunpowder. I saw the smoke on the left. I knew what it meant. A volley coming. I could see Thomas, and I could see the smoke, and I had time. Half a second, maybe a full second, enough to reach out and pull him behind the fence rail. Silence. And I did not move. My body locked up. My hands would not work. I stood there and the bullet got to him before I did, and he went down 3 feet in front of me with a mini-ball through his chest, and his mouth was moving and nothing was coming out, and I could not move. He stopped. His breath was ragged, and his ribs screamed, and the stitches above his eye pulled with every word. "Half a second," he said. "That is what it was. Half a second where I froze and my brother died. And I have been carrying that half second for 23 years. And it is why I live alone, and it is why I do not trust myself around people who need me. And it is why I chose that girl in Griggs's yard. Not because I am good, because I cannot stand still again while somebody in front of me is dying. I was frozen once. I will not be frozen twice." Harlan was quiet for a very long time. The lamp flickered. Outside, a horse stamped in the street. "I was behind the sunken road," Harlan said. "I could see the cornfield through the smoke. Men were falling on both sides, and I could not tell which ones were ours anymore. My brother Samuel was somewhere in that field. 12th Georgia, 20 years old. I never found out exactly where he fell. Never had the chance to freeze or not freeze. I do not know if that is better or worse. 2 men, 2 dead brothers, same field, different sides, same wound." Neither one spoke for a while, and the silence that filled the room was the first honest thing that had passed between a Union man and a Confederate in that office. Maybe in that territory. Maybe anywhere. Harlan stood up. He walked to his desk and opened a drawer and came back with a bottle of bourbon. He poured 2 glasses, handed one to Elias. "There is something else," Harlan said. "Something I need to tell you before we go any further." Elias took the glass, waited. "I was at Griggs's yard 2 days before you." The words hung in the air. "I saw her chained to that fence post. I asked Griggs the price, $20. I had the money in my pocket." Harlan drank, set the glass down. "I rode home. Told myself it was not my business, told myself Cyrus would come get her, and I did not need that kind of trouble. I sat in this office and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, and I did not sleep, and I have not slept right since." Long silence. "You are a better man than me, Boone. Or a dumber one. I have not decided which." Elias looked at him. "Neither have I." Harlan picked up his medical bag. "I am coming with you. Tonight." I owe that girl something. I owe myself something. And I have been sitting in this office long enough. The door to Harlan's office opened, and Margaret Yates was standing on the stairs with her shotgun, and a look on her face that said she had been listening through the thin wall for the past 10 minutes, and was not sorry about it. I sent a telegram to the territorial judge in Cheyenne 2 hours ago, Margaret said. He will be here in 3 or 4 days. We do not have 3 or 4 days, Elias said. I know. That is why I brought this. She held out a Winchester lever action rifle. The stock was scratched and the barrel had a dull patina, but it was oiled and clean, and the action when she worked it cycled smooth. That was my husband's, Margaret said. He did not deserve it, and neither does Cyrus Whitlock. And then the last piece arrived. Marshal Tom Briggs came up the stairs. He looked like a man who had been fighting with himself for 2 days and had finally lost, which is to say he looked like a man who had finally decided to do the right thing and was terrified of the cost. He stood in the doorway, and he spoke carefully, the way a man speaks when he is handing someone a loaded gun while looking the other direction. If someone were to go to Whitlock's property and remove the girl before the judge arrives, I could not sanction that. But if Whitlock were to respond with violence in front of witnesses, a doctor say, and a storekeeper, well, that would be assault. Assault I can act on. Do not need Stroud's signature for an arrest on witnessed assault. He looked at Elias. He looked at Harlan. He looked at Margaret. I will be a 1/4 mile down the road, waiting. If I hear a disturbance, I will respond. That is all. He turned and walked down the stairs and disappeared into the dark. Elias stood up. His ribs screamed. His eye was swollen shut. He picked up the dead preacher's Winchester and felt the weight of it. Different from Thomas's gun, but the same mechanism, the same cold certainty in the hands. His hands remembered what to do. Harlan picked up his medical bag. Margaret racked the shotgun. It was not an army. It was barely a plan. It was a broke rancher with cracked ribs, a Confederate surgeon carrying 24 years of guilt, and a preacher's widow with a 12-gauge and an opinion. But it was moving. And for the first time in 23 years, Elias Boone was not frozen. Clara heard the horse at midnight and knew, the way she knew weather and the weight of a man's step and the difference between a fist that warns and a fist that means it, that it was not Cyrus coming home. The knock confirmed it. Cyrus never knocked on his own door. 3 soft knocks on wood, then silence. Then a voice she had heard in her head for 2 days, the low voice that announced itself at thresholds and offered food on porch steps and stepped back instead of forward. Clara. It is Elias. She had already cut the rope around her wrists with the glass shard. She had been ready for hours, not for rescue, for opportunity. Clara had stopped waiting for rescue when she was 17. What she waited for was a door to open, and what she did when it opened was walk through it on her own 2 feet. She opened the door. Elias stood on the porch, one eye swollen shut, leaning to the right because of the ribs, holding a Winchester that was not Thomas's. He looked like a man who had been hit by a horse and had gotten up and saddled the horse and ridden it 14 miles in the dark. You look like hell, Clara said. You should see the other side. First thing close to humor either of them had managed. It lasted half a second. Then they moved. Clara stepped out of the house and into the yard. Margaret Yates was there 10 feet from the front porch, standing beside her painted mare with the shotgun at her hip and her gray dress pale in the starlight. Doc Harlan was beside her with his medical bag in one hand and a notebook in the other. Cyrus Whitlock came out of the house like a man rising from a bad dream. He had the shotgun. He always had the shotgun. He came through the front door and stopped when he saw 3 people in his yard where there should have been none. You are trespassing on my property, Cyrus said. His voice was the calm one, the measured one. But his hands were shaking and the barrel of the shotgun trembled, and Clara could see the withdrawal eating him in real time. 4 days since his last laudanum. His body was in revolt, and his mind was barely holding the reins. I am here to conduct a medical examination of Miss Clara Dunn, Harlan said. Professional discretion, duty of care, and I am here because I want to be, Margaret said. Cyrus looked at them. His eyes, glassy and unfocused, moved from Margaret to Harlan to Elias to Clara and back. He swung the shotgun toward Elias. Elias had the Winchester raised, 15 feet apart. At that range, everybody hits. Nobody misses. The question is not aim. The question is who pulls the trigger first, and what happens to the world after. And then Elias did the thing that Clara did not expect, and that Cyrus did not expect, and that nobody in a Western story is supposed to do. He lowered the rifle. Clara said, "What are you doing?" Elias looked at Cyrus. His one working eye was steady. "Go ahead," Elias said. Cyrus blinked. "You have got a shotgun, and I have got a doctor and a storekeeper watching. You shoot me, and Harlan writes it down, and Margaret rides to Briggs, and you hang for murder. You do not shoot me, and you have got nothing. The girl is standing behind me. The judge is coming from Cheyenne. Your paper is worthless. Either way, you are done. Only question is whether you are done breathing or done free." He was betting his life, not because he was brave, not because he was stupid, because he knew Cyrus Whitlock. Clara had told him everything about this man, and the most important thing she told him was this: Cyrus never does his own violence. Cyrus sends other men. Cyrus waits in the back and lets the Dentons bleed, and when the bleeding is done, Cyrus walks in and claims the victory. But tonight, Holt was hurt. Webb had run. Lyle was at his mother's house. Stroud would not come out at midnight. Cyrus was alone. For the first time in his life, there was no one between him and the consequence of pulling a trigger. And alone. Cyrus Whitlock was a thin man with shaking hands and hollow cheeks and glassy eyes, who had not had laudanum in 4 days and could not stop the tremor in his trigger finger long enough to commit to murder. The shotgun lowered, inch by inch, like a flag coming down. Clara walked forward. She took the shotgun from his hands. He did not resist. His arms dropped to his sides, and he stood there in the doorway of his own house, and he looked at Clara, and she looked at him. Not with hatred, not with triumph, not with satisfaction or contempt or pity, or any of the things she had imagined feeling in this moment during 4 years of imagining it. She looked at him with nothing, indifference, the total, complete, devastating absence of significance. He did not matter anymore. The man who had burned her and broken her and boarded up her windows and chained her to a fence post and sold her for opium debt did not matter anymore. And that was worse than anything she could have done to him with the hatchet. Because hatred means someone still holds power over you, and indifference means they do not. Cyrus looked at her face and saw the nothing in it, and something inside him snapped. He grabbed the kerosene lamp from the table by the door. He threw it into his own barn. The glass shattered. The kerosene splashed. The hay caught. It was not a plan. It was not strategy. It was the action of a brain that had been held together by laudanum and control for 10 years and had lost both in the same week. The fire was not revenge. It was collapse. A man who had built his entire life around owning things, watching himself destroy the last thing he owned, because if he could not control the world, then the world could burn. The barn went up fast. Orange light poured across the yard. Shadows leaped against the house. The heat pushed out in waves, and from down the road the sound of hooves, fast, coming closer. Marshal Tom Briggs rode into the light with his badge catching the fire glow, and his face set in the expression of a man who'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it in equal measure. "I see arson," Briggs said. "That is an arrestable offense. Do not need Stroud for that." He dismounted. He walked to Cyrus Whitlock, who was standing in the yard watching his barn burn with the blank expression of a man who has just walked off the edge of his own world. Briggs put the cuffs on him. 3 days later, Territorial Judge William Pruitt arrived from Cheyenne. He held a hearing in the town hall. It was efficient. No speeches, no grandstanding. Doc Harlan presented 2 years of medical records showing Amos Dunn's X mark on every document. He presented his formal examination of Clara's injuries, which he had conducted by lamplight in Margaret Yates's store the morning after the rescue. 7 cigar burns, 2 improperly healed finger fractures, ligature scarring on both wrists consistent with prolonged shackling. Cyrus's 3 witnesses, Hadley, Finch, and Slade, crumbled under Pwitt's questioning when confronted with the dated medical records. A man who signs with an X in April does not learn to write his full name by June. One of them, old Garrett Slade, broke down and admitted that Cyrus had written the will himself and paid Slade $5 to say he had watched Amos sign it. Marin Denton testified. She confirmed she had heard Clara's distress from 3 miles away for 4 years and had done nothing. She wept on the stand. Clara did not forgive her. Clara nodded once. Acknowledgement. Nothing more. Clara spoke last. She stood at the front of the room and faced every person in it, and she said what she had to say in the fewest words that would carry the truth. My name is Clara Dunn, not Whitlock. Never was Whitlock. I can read, write, mend a fence, ride a horse, and shoot a tin can at 40 yards. I am not anyone's property. That is all I have to say. She sat down. No applause. Silence, the hard kind. The kind that means people have heard something they cannot unhear. Pwitt ruled. The indenture document was void. The will was fraudulent. Clara Dunn was a free citizen of Wyoming Territory. Cyrus Whitlock was bound over for trial on charges of assault, forgery, unlawful confinement, and arson, to be held in the territorial jail at Cheyenne pending proceedings before the territorial court. Alderman Stroud was stripped of his commission as Justice of the Peace. Briggs led Cyrus out. Clara watched through the window. Cyrus sat on the bench in the county jail, holding his arm, staring at nothing. The face of a man who had just discovered that the world he built, the world where he owned things and people and nobody said no, had edges. And he had walked off them. Clara turned away from the window. The street was bright. Her boots were on her feet. Her name was her own. And the man leaning against the hitching post with a borrowed rifle and one eye still swollen half shut looked like the most tired, beaten-up, stubborn, beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life. Take me home, Elias, she said, and she meant every word of it. The ride home took 2 hours. They did not speak for the first one, not because there was nothing to say, but because some silences weigh more than words, and this one had earned its weight. They rode north on the main road. Juniper walked steady. Elias sat behind Clara in the saddle because his ribs could not take the jolt of walking, and she could not take the weight of being alone. And this compromise, 2 broken people sharing a lame horse on a dirt road in Wyoming Territory, was the most honest arrangement either of them had ever been part of. They came to Harlan Bridge. Clara pulled Juniper to a stop. She looked down at the water, moving fast, cold. The same water she had stood above a year ago when she was 17, different kinds of broken. And the rail was the only thing between her and the kind of silence that does not end. She looked at it for a long time. Elias did not ask. He sat behind her and held the reins loose and waited. He did not know the specific history of this bridge, but he knew the look on a person's face when they are revisiting the place where they almost ended, and measuring the distance between who they were then and who they are now. He had seen that look in his own reflection every time he passed a cornfield. Clara looked at the water. She breathed. She turned Juniper north. They kept riding. Not a single word was spoken. The ranch came into view past the low ridge. Cabin, corral, creek. The barn was whole because Cyrus had burned his own barn, not theirs. The fence posts Clara and Elias had driven together stood straight in the afternoon sun. The door of the cabin was open. Clara dismounted and stood in the yard. She stood there for a long time, looking at the open door, and the crooked porch, and the 3 chickens, and the land that stretched out in every direction like a promise that nobody had bothered to make. But that was there anyway, written in dirt and grass and the thin line of the creek running south. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She walked inside. 2 weeks passed. They rebuilt what needed rebuilding and let stand what could stand, and the days fell into a rhythm that neither of them named because naming it would have made it a thing that could be taken away, and they had both lost enough things to know better. Clara worked 3 days a week at Margaret Yates's store. Margaret had lost a third of her inventory when Lyle Denton set fire to her storeroom on Cyrus's orders the night before Cyrus was arrested. Margaret did not complain. She swept the ash and counted what was left, and opened the next morning because that was what you did when the world knocked you down. You swept and you counted and you opened. Clara earned wages, her first earned money in her life. She bought a new shirt for Elias with her second week's pay. A cotton work shirt, plain, sturdy. She left it on the porch rail the same way she had left the blanket, without ceremony, without explanation, because some things do not need words, and the people who understand them without being told. Elias wore it the next day. He wore it crooked, the collar turned up on one side. Clara straightened it without thinking. Her fingers touched his neck for half a second, the briefest contact, skin on skin, and both of them went very still. A stillness that was not fear and was not caution, but was the specific stillness of two people standing at the edge of something they are not ready to name, and looking at each other across the gap. She stepped back. He cleared his throat. They went back to work. Doc Harlan rode out once a week to check Elias's ribs. The ribs were healing. The eye had opened, the swelling gone down to a faint purple shadow that made him look less like a man who had been hit with a shotgun stock, and more like a man who had lost a disagreement with a doorframe. One evening Harlan stayed for whiskey. They sat on the porch in the fading light with their glasses and their silence. Samuel was 20, Harlan said. 12th Georgia. I never found where he fell. Thomas was 17, Elias said. 1st Corps. I was 10 feet away. Long silence. Crickets. Creak. Wind through the cottonwood by the barn. That cornfield took the two best of us, and left the two most stubborn, Harlan said. Nobody laughed. Nobody needed to. Some truths are too heavy for laughter and too true for tears, and the only thing left to do with them is sit on a porch and drink whiskey, and let the quiet carry what the words cannot. Elias went to the land office in town. He tried to add Clara's name to the ranch deed. The clerk looked at the paperwork. You are adding a name. Yeah. You two married? No. Then I cannot add her to a deed of ownership. Territorial law requires... She owns half the fence posts, half the lumber, and half the sweat that went into rebuilding this place, Elias said. She owns it because she built it. I do not need a law to tell me that. Just put her name on the paper. The clerk wrote it up. Elias brought it home. Clara looked at the deed. She looked at it for a long time. Then she shook her head. Not yet. When my name goes on that paper, it will be because I built enough of this place to earn it. Not because you gave it to me. She was right. He knew she was right. He did not argue. Some things you do not argue with because the person saying them has earned the right to say them, and the least you can do is listen. Autumn came slow and golden. The aspens along the creek turned yellow. The mornings got cold. The light changed, going from the harsh white blaze of summer to something softer, warmer, the color of honey held up to a window. Clara found the wooden box under the bed on a Tuesday morning in October. She had known it was there since the first day. She had not touched it because other people's private things were not her business. But now, after 3 months, after fences and barns and a fire and a trial and a bridge, she had crossed twice, once almost going down and once riding past. The boundary between his private things and hers had shifted enough that she carried the box to the porch and set it on the step between them. Elias looked at it. His face changed. Something opened behind his eyes, a door he had kept closed not out of secrecy, but out of the particular grief that comes from looking at objects that belong to someone who will never pick them up again. That was Thomas's, he said. Can I open it? He nodded. Clara opened the latch. Inside was a folded letter in a young man's handwriting, a brass uniform button, a small photograph on stiff cardboard, and a silver hair comb with a mother-of-pearl inlay that caught the autumn light like a piece of trapped sky. She held up the photograph. 2 boys. One tall and serious with eyes that looked exactly like the man sitting beside her. One shorter, grinning chin tilted up like he was daring the camera to blink first. Thomas? Yeah, he looks like trouble. The best kind. Clara set the photograph down carefully. She picked up the silver comb, turned it in her fingers. The mother-of-pearl was smooth and cool, and it caught the light differently every time she moved it, throwing tiny rainbows across her hand. This was your mother's? Thomas kept it, said he was saving it for someone important. Elias. I cannot. Thomas would have taken one look at a girl who swung a hatchet at a man twice her size and said that is exactly the kind of person who needs a silver comb. Clara held the comb for a long time. Then she reached back and slid it into her hair. It held. It fit. She touched it once with her fingertips. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. Some things are said in the touching of a comb, and the fitting of it, and the way a woman's hand comes down from her hair and rests on the porch rail, 3 inches from a man's hand, and does not move away. October turned. The barn was finished. The fences held. The creek ran clear. 3 new chickens joined the original 3, a gift from Margaret, who said she had too many, and everyone knew she did not. The root cellar was stocked for winter. The woodpile was stacked to the eaves. Clara went inside one evening when the light was going gold and the air smelled like sage and cold, and the first real hint of what was coming. She came back carrying the deed of land, the one she had refused to sign weeks ago. She sat beside Elias on the porch step, closer than the first night. Closer than the second or the third or any night since, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, the way you feel warmth from a stove when you have been standing in the cold for a long time and you finally step close enough. She put the deed on his knee. She took out the pencil Margaret had given her. She signed, Clara Dunn. Not because Elias offered, not because he asked, not because he gave it to her, because she had rebuilt half a barn, because she had mended 47 fence rails, because she had stacked a winter's worth of firewood with her own crooked fingers and her scarred arms and her 2 good legs in boots that fit, because she had stood in a courtroom and said her name out loud and meant every letter of it, because she had earned it the way you earn anything worth having, which is through work and time and the daily, unremarkable, unglamorous act of showing up and doing what needs doing. Elias looked at the signature. Clara Dunn. Written steady. Written sure. Written in a hand that did not shake. He looked at her. The silver comb in her hair, the scar on her wrist, the gray eyes that had something new in them that had not been there at Griggs's yard. Not fear, not caution, not the flat survival calculation that had kept her alive for 4 years. Something warmer, something with roots, something that looked like it intended to stay. Now ask me, Clara said. He looked at her. She looked at him. The autumn light was on both of them, and the door behind them was open, and the land stretched out in every direction, and the only sound was the creek and the wind and the chickens and somewhere a long way off a coyote calling for something that might or might not call back. Elias Boone took off his hat, set it on the step, put it on again, took it off again. He did not know what to do with his hands when they were not holding a rifle or a hammer or a fence post, and this moment required something his hands had never done before. He put his hat on straight for once, and in Black Hollow Valley, where the land was cheap because nobody in their right mind wanted it, 2 people who had been broken by the world sat on a porch in the autumn light. Not rescued and rescuer, not buyer and bought, not debtor and owed. 2 stubborn, cracked, rebuilding people who had chosen each other for the only reason worth choosing, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The door behind them was open. It always would be. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And remember, Nobody on this earth has the right to own another person. Not with chains, not with paper, not with silence. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done at that auction yard? I will be reading every single one.